Hello everyone, how's everybody doing? Hope you're doing fine. A little better than me. I suffer from arthritis, so I've got all kinds of problems with bones and tendons and so on. Some people die of cancer, some people die of diabetes. Well, I'm going to die of, I guess, of arthritis and related pains. God's punishing me. Anyways, today I'm going to be continuing with Ayn Rand. We haven't finished with her. And again, I want to clarify that I'm not picking specifically on good old Ayn. Ayn, as some people call her. What I'm doing is really picking on all of philosophy. Okay, it's all related. And yeah, one of the issues that we have, and the reason we ended up with this problem, is that we never defined crisply, rigorously, the foundations of science, of physics, and philosophy. And we never distinguished between them. And it all starts with this gentleman here. His name was Aristotle. I blame him primarily because that's the fellow that everybody analyzed. I mean, they did analyze Plato and Socrates and some of the other Greeks, but I think that the main current that led to what we call science today really comes from this man. He set the foundations for what physics is, what metaphysics is, and all that was mumbled, jumbled into what we call philosophy, somehow, parts of it. And the real thing, how it all really started was that, you know, these people would begin, like a lot of people do today. Nothing has changed really in the last 3,000 years. They start out by saying, well, what exists out there? That's the starting point. You know, what exists? And then the second step to that is, well, they're going to determine what exists through the senses, through see and touch primarily. And, you know, a very important question there is, why don't they use taste and smell and hearing? No, they use see and touch, those two senses. They love those two senses. Okay, so then you go in there and through see and touch you determine what exists. Okay, so you can touch the wall. So you say, well, the wall exists. I touched the table exists. Okay, and now you know what exists out there. And then from there, somehow, people jump into what everybody's an expert at, and that's on how you should behave and politics, how the world should be run. And you say, well, what does existence of, you know, inert matter out there have to do with politics and with ethics? And this is the man who tied them in, or at least one of them. I mean, the Greeks all did this. Everybody did this throughout history. But again, this is the line of thinking that the scientific branch followed. The religious branch, they followed Plato. You know, they started talking about things that don't exist, like shadows. And they turned those shadows into souls and spirits and, you know, who knows what, angels. Okay. So, yeah, I blame this gentleman here. And as you can see, I put there that philosophy is in ruins, just like the Parthenon. Why? Because, yeah, we don't have a good philosophy. You go to the Stanford the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and what do you find? You find nonsense. You find the history of words. In the glossary, you know, you find the history of words. You don't find the definitions of words. Okay, you find out what all the so-called philosophers thought about that word throughout history. You go into physics, what do you find? You find black holes and dark matter, conveniently invisible and heavy, just as needed by the equations. You know, it's like ad hoc. And, you know, some people say, well, you know, what's wrong with that? But what's wrong with that is that there is no physical object that is zero-dimensional and has, whatever, infinite mass. Yeah, that's great for the equations. It doesn't tell us what physically exists out there. And again, a lot of people confuse and think that philosophy is the mother of all sciences because you need to philosophize before you do any science. You need to kind of determine what exists out there, and they put that under a branch called ontology, or part of metaphysics. And so you start there, and then you work your way to physics, which is not physics, it's math, descriptions, calculations, measurement. And from there, you get back to philosophy to say, well, this is, I think, the way we should run the world, and this is what I think is good and bad, and moral and immoral, etc., etc. So that's the world we have today. And of course, in rational science, we had to change all that. We had to erase the board completely. And of course, people don't like that because they were raised and educated in this, frame of mind, this frame of thinking. And when a guy like me comes around and says, look, we got to erase all that, everything, completely. Erase the board entirely, let's begin all over again. We started off on the wrong foot, we evolved or developed all that stuff on the wrong foot, and we ended up on the wrong foot. Okay? We have no definitions today of any critical term that we use either in philosophy or physics or science, right? We have irrational explanations, warped space-time, that's gravity, particles that come back from the future or that travel faster than light, tachyons. They're so fast they come from the future or the past, who knows. We have irrational explanations. We don't know what an atom looks like. We can't rationalize an atom. We have this little bead going around a nucleus, and no one can tell you what ties or binds the bead to the nucleus. Why doesn't the bead spontaneously fly away? No one can rationalize that for you, so we don't have a picture of the atom. And they say, and the answer they give you is not that, let me show you what my atom looks like. No, they say, well, we don't know what an atom looks like because we can't really see in there. We can't peer inside the atom, know how the electron does this and all that stuff. So we don't have an answer. We don't have an atom. We don't know what how a magnet attracts another. We don't know what gravity is. Like when you let go of a pen, why does it fall to the center of the earth? You can't use warp space for that because that's out there in the cosmos. That's for the big picture, not for the small picture here on Earth. On Earth, you got to use quantum processes or mechanisms. And so we don't have answers. We don't have a single answer. And why? Because we don't have the foundation straight. We have to start by organizing the foundations first, not put them like Ari here did. He put them on quicksand. And we've been building on quicksand ever since. And so those foundations are shaky and the whole building is, tittering and tottering. We have to put it on sound concrete. We have to have solid foundations. Okay, that's what this site is about. And of course, that destroys a lot of religions, because if you were born, raised, and educated in a certain way, and suddenly you find this site, and you say, "Oh, but you're changing everything." Yes, yes, I am. There's a paradigm shift, and we're not here to convince you. We're not here for you to get you to believe. We're here to get you to understand and realize what the differences are with what everyone from Aristotle to Stephen Hawking, Ayn Rand, etc. did compared to what we do here. Okay, so all you need to do is understand the differences. You reach your own conclusion in your own dark basement. Okay, so let's begin. What were the problems? Well, here we have a definition of the word science. Okay, we started science because that's what we try to do here, and Ayn Rand was one that had these notions, these same notions I'm going to cover here, about science, about physics, about philosophy, which is what everybody has, essentially. So, again, I'm picking on Ayn, but as an example of what everybody out there believes, or the notions people have, okay? Science, what is this? This is out of Berkeley University. Our knowledge of the natural world and the process through which that knowledge is built. The process of science relies on the testing of ideas with evidence gathered from the natural world. Science as a whole cannot be precisely defined. Love that. But can be broadly described by a set of key characteristics. Okay? So these people think it's all subjective. Science is subjective. They test ideas with evidence. Well, evidence is what the prosecutor uses to persuade the jury. So evidence is subjective, always. Is there evidence of God? Well, you will have half the world say that, yeah, there is evidence of God, the perfection of nature, etc. That's their evidence. And other people say, no, there's no evidence. I've never touched or seen God, so whatever. You know, they have all these arguments. And so what evidence is in the eye of the beholder. Evidence is subjective. Evidence belongs to religion. Please don't bring the four-letter word evidence into your comments here. And so, yeah, people say, hold it, we've always relied on evidence. No, that's to convince you. Okay, evidence is used only to persuade and convince. So we don't use evidence in real science, okay? Here's the comparison. Here's the rational science version of science, okay? Rational explanations. Now, was that hard? Was that difficult? See all that verbiage that the people have today at Berkeley compared to the single sentence rational explanation or fragment there? That's what science is. Just an explanation, a rational explanation. Just give me an explanation. I'll decide whether it's knowledge. I'll decide whether it's the evidence convinced me. I'll do that in my own basement, and that's extra scientific. Okay? Science is divided into physics and philosophy. Okay, so that's important because we're going to say that physics deals with mechanisms, whereas philosophy deals with behaviors, with purpose or reasons why someone did something. Okay, and just in case, I want to add a little more fuel to the fire here because of what I'm going to say next. Here we have Mr. Donald Simonek. He's a professor of physics emeritus, Lock Haven University. Wrote a lot of papers, etc. And he says science doesn't explain, science describes. Okay, I want you to keep that in mind because of the definitions we're going to have next about the scientific method. I mean, what is the scientific method if science doesn't explain, if science describes? Let's see if we have compatibility. Let's start there, okay? Objectively, okay? And here's a scientific method according to two sources. One of them is, this is from the Wikipedia, and you can see the word explanation there, okay? Hypothesis, and I like it, the fact that they say theoretical, hypothetical explanations of observations and measurements. And the question here is, what's the difference between a theoretical and a hypothetical explanation? Is there a difference between theoretical and hypothetical? And you know, they use these words interchangeably, and they say that a hypothesis is a theory, and a theory is a hypothesis. Okay, and you'll see that mixture, that blending everywhere. People have a notion, a vague notion, that these two words are synonyms. Okay, and we're going to show that they're not. They're two different words. Hypothesis has nothing at all to do with theory. Okay, and you can see there, form an explanatory hypothesis. Okay, again, very weird notion of a hypothetical explanation. We use that word, but the word hypothetical in that context is simply of ordinary speech, not a scientific definition or notion. Okay, and here we have one of the primary academies out there, and they define the scientific method thus. They say these are the steps essentially that everybody has essentially out there. Okay, you make an observation. Okay, you have to observe to do science. Okay, ask a question. Okay, ask some meaningful question, I guess. Form a hypothesis or testable explanation. I thought Mr. Simonek said we don't explain, we describe. We had a little bit of a contradiction. Some people talk about explanations, other people talk about descriptions. What descriptions are they referring to? Mathematical descriptions. An equation is only a description. An equation does not explain absolutely anything. It's just a description. And that's why the mathematicians, since the 17th century so-called scientific revolution, turned science into descriptions because that's all they do. That's all that math does. It describes. And then the explanation was left for the philosophers. In other words, you have an explanation, but that's your opinion. You know, how does the universe work? Well, we can't see how. We can't see the invisible mediators. So it's all an opinion. It all comes down to your personal opinion. Well, you think it's God that moved, you know, the ball downwards. And another guy said, no, it's particles that pushed it downwards. The other guy said, no, it just slid through warp space. And so we have all these theories why the ball came down, right? And they say, well, that's philosophy. That's opinion. So we don't deal with that. We deal with math because that's, you know, fixed. That's rational. That's logical. Okay? And so what has happened is that physics, which is regarded as a synonym of science, has grown into descriptions rather than into explanations. And Simonek at least realizes that, but some people don't, apparently. You know, they still talk about explanation, testable explanation. I'm going to test the explanation, okay? So I'm going to test whether God is really the guy moving the ball now. I don't know how I'm going to test that, okay? Make a prediction. Predictions. I thought astrologers did predictions, you know, and somehow this has creeped into science. You say, well, how did predictions get in there? And I'll tell you how they got in there. Because, see, if a mathematician says, okay, I measured and I calculated, and this car is running at 50 miles per hour. So now I can predict in 1 hour it will be 50 miles away. So he can predict, okay, and he can predict whether the moon's going to cause an eclipse because the moon is rolling at a certain speed, actually 1 kilometer per second around the Earth. That's the speed of the moon around the Earth. And if it continues, everything else being equal, at 2 o'clock tomorrow, there's going to be an eclipse. So he can predict. And so predictions entered the realm of physics because that's what mathematicians do. They can predict with their equations, but they can predict descriptions. They can say this is going to happen at this point in time. They cannot tell you why the moon doesn't fly away. That's what we want to understand. And this is what they dismissed as philosophy. Okay? And then they're going to test the prediction, okay, see if the prediction came true, whether your horse really did win the race, right, the prediction. And then do it again, you know, one more time. Iterate, okay? Okay, so these are the notions we have of science and the scientific method, okay? What is our counter proposal? Well, here it is, okay? This is the rational scientific method. We have hypotheses, which are not theories, they are assumptions. The Greeks used to put, you know, they used the hypothesis primarily for geometry, and they would draw a picture of what they were going, of the thing they were going to prove, right? They had created a set of axioms, and then from there they developed their theory, which was really a description, okay? Which it was rates and ratios, primarily ratios in the case of geometry. And so when the 17th century revolution came in, they confused the hypothesis with the explanation rather than with the assumptions, with what the Greeks had drawn on the board to begin their explanation, okay, which was not even an explanation. It was just a description, again, of rates, primarily ratios. Okay, and so hypothesis includes the objects, the definitions, and the initial scene, where the starting point, the first few frames of your film. Okay, the theory are the mechanisms in the case of physics again, right? Mechanisms and causes, and then finally you have the conclusions, the corollaries, you know, interpretations. Okay, so that in a nutshell, you can see the differences between the rational scientific method and what these people are doing today. Okay, we have a difference, and of course. We end up with the definition of physics. What is physics about? Which is, I think everybody will agree, is one of the branches of science, right? At least, I think there we're all on the same boat, okay? And this is the official version. This is what you'll find again in the Wikipedia, and where is it in the, there's a site that I picked at random. They all say the same thing. And it says, physics, knowledge of nature. No. We know, okay? Nobody defined knowledge, but we know, okay? Is the natural science that studies. We just study. So you study, and because of that, you are doing science, you know, just because you studied. Okay, so we got a problem with that word. Study is matter. It's motion and behavior through space and time. How does matter move through nothing or through a concept such as time? I thought you can move through molasses. I thought you could move maybe through a wall if you're strong enough, like Superman, right? Maybe you can move through air, through the water, but you can't move through nothing. There's nothing through which to move. And you can't move through a concept. I can't move through love. But these people claim that they can move through time. So we got a problem with the definitions, with these notions, because people have not ironed them out. That's my point. And that studies the related entities of energy and force. So energy and force are physical objects, are entities, are things. Oh, for that we need to define what a thing is, what an entity is, what something is. And I don't think energy is a something. Energy is obviously a concept. And obviously we have to distinguish between concepts and objects. Energy is not an entity, neither is force. These are verbs. They've turned verbs into nouns. That's what's happened. Okay, why? Because that's what math does. Okay, energy is a word of math. Force is a word of math. Time is a word of math. All these are quantities that they put in equations. They turned all these concepts into physical objects, and now they say you can move through them. You're swimming through energy. Okay. Okay, and then you can see the guy on the bottom says the same thing. He says interactions of matter and energy. How does matter interact with a concept? So we got problems with these definitions. They haven't been ironed out. These people are talking in parables. They're talking in language that has nothing to do with physics. Okay. Okay. So if that's what physics is, well, let me put my version of physics here so that we can compare. Where's rational physics? Here it is. Okay. Very hard, very difficult. Rational explanations of mechanisms. Okay. Did you understand it? Did you have to take an advanced course in mathematics at the university, get a PhD to understand that definition? It's very simple. You just have to explain a mechanism. That's what physics does. Okay? And all this nonsense about the interaction in studying and the interaction of matter and concepts and going through concepts. Now, we don't deal with all that. They deal with that in religion. Okay? Okay, so we get to good old Ayn Rand, and we've had her notion of philosophy the other day. She created what she calls a philosophy, which is again the notion of philosophy that we've had since the days of Aristotle, and that's this mumble jumble thing where anything goes. It's just a way of thinking. That's what philosophy means to them. And so Ayn Rand came up with this notion that she calls her philosophy objectivism. And the least thing that it has is objectivism. It's subjectivism from beginning to end. It always introduces the observer. Why? Because Ayn Rand was not in the process of doing philosophy as we understand it in rational science. She was in the process of doing something else. Okay, she was trying to do physics. Sorry, not physics. She was trying to do politics. Okay, that was what she was all about. She was about doing politics and ethics, how you should behave, recommendation, and what the best form of government is. Again, recommendation. She was into recommendations, and that's religion. That's opinion. That's belief. And that's what everyone since the days of Aristotle did. They just gave you opinions. Everybody's an expert on opinions. We're all experts. We all have our opinions. And no, this is the way you should behave. This is what you should eat to be healthy. This is the best way to run a government. If you only followed my advice. And that's what Ayn Rand did. That's all she did. She just had opinions. And says, my philosophy, and here you can see it, my philosophy in essence is the concept of man as a heroic being with his own happiness. Happiness? It's like I said last week, you know, one of my professors, instructors at the university, first day in economics, said, here we're going to define happiness as money. If you have money, you are happy. So that's an opinion, okay? Some people don't agree with that, you know, philosophy, right? As the moral purpose of his life. Moral? I mean, I kill bugs every day. Is that moral? Is that right? Am I doing the right thing by killing the fly that's buzzing in front of my eye, my nose? You know? Okay, with productive achievement. So if you're unproductive, that's wrong, that's bad. I mean, as far as I know, assuming Jesus Christ existed, right, ever was on earth, he was just a barefooted guy, you know, who talked. He wasn't very productive in that sense, I guess. You know, so I don't know. I guess we had to exclude Mr. Jesus Christ from this notion that she has, right? He wasn't very productive in that sense, at least. And his noblest activity. Noblest, that sounds like an adjective that you know, tells you something about opinions also. What is noble? Okay. So again, she had all these vague notions of philosophy. She called her philosophy, so-called philosophy, objectivism. Okay. And here you can see, you know, the differences between her and what rational science does. Here we have philosophy, just the rational explanations of behaviors, and we look at reasons and purpose primarily. Okay, what did she do? She did a guide for living, course we take in life, how we treat other people. Sounds like opinions to me. Sounds like subjective. Philosophy is the science, I like the word science there, that studies existence. Again, she studies, and it studies existence. Well, what does existence have to do with a guide for living, course do we take in life, how we treat other people? What does one thing have to do with another? So what we see here is that all these philosophers, everyone from Aristotle all the way to these days, has done the same thing. Well, they mumble-jumbled everything in there. They put everything in there. They said it's a jack of all trades. Okay, you know, philosophy studies everything. Philosophy is existence. It's how you should behave. It's politics, justice, ethics. You know, aesthetics, epistemology. How we know what we know. So this is the problem. The problem, we don't have precise definitions of science, of physics, and of philosophy. Our foundations are not, you know, on solid concrete. They're on quicksand. And of course, it shouldn't surprise you that the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy cannot define a single word. All they can do is just tell you the history and what different philosophers believed in. And the physicists, the so-called physicists, mathematical physicists, which are nothing but mathematicians, okay, you know, they come up with these things that they claim exist. Black holes, dark matter, corpuscles which are not corpuscle. In other words, particles which are not particles. Zero-dimensional particles which have all these magical properties. And Big Bang, you know, the creation of existence from nothing, self-creation. Because all these people are so-called atheists. They don't believe that there's a God. So what they have is, you know, they have to explain the existence, that everything exists, and they say it came from nothing. And this nothing, what is that? That's energy. And the energy turned into matter. That's the explanation you get. And so the question is whether any of that is rational. Okay. Okay. This is where we stand today. We don't have a great definition. Because of that, a lot of the comments that are made, especially on this site, they don't pick up on that. They still have these old notions of what philosophy and physics and science are. And here you can see some of these comments that were made, some questions and comments, and I'm going to go over them here in a little series. Here's one guy. He says, a physicist should get a builder's plumb bob and a very long line hanging from a very tall skyscraper building. It should point to the middle of the earth, okay? If you do this at both sides of the building, then there should be a difference in the length of the base of the building to the top of the building, okay? In fact, all buildings should be bigger at the top of the building. It should be bigger at the top of the building, okay? No problem. But they aren't. After doing your experiments, get back to me. Okay, so I measure. And he says, if I measure, I did physics. I did science. So I measure a table and find out a table is longer here and shorter there or whatever, right? Come back with precise measurements. And he calls that physics. I did physics. See, they have the wrong notion of physics. They're not even in the ballpark. They're not even on the same page. They're not, they're not into physics anymore. These people think that physics is about measuring, about describing, saying it's bigger at the top of the building than at the bottom. So what? Okay, so it's bigger. And we need to explain gravity. We need to explain how a magnet attracts another, not measure tables and say, look, the table is bigger on that side than it is on this side. That's what math does. And they call that physics, okay, as you can see. These are the notions people have, and it's very hard to get them out of there because they've been brainwashed to exhaustion. And that's all they do. They think that they're doing physics. They really think that that's what physics is about. Here's another one. Question. A fellow who came over to make a little bit of fun of me. Okay, no problem. I can take it. I got thick skin. And an object must have location in order to exist. Not true. That's not what I say. But again, these people slur over. They superficially treat the subject. They read in a very sketchy manner, and they come up with this notion. No, that's not the definition of location. Okay, of exist. Okay, yeah, an object must have location in order to exist. But see, listen to what the counter argument. How can you have location without a reference point, another object? Okay, yeah, you need another object in order to have location. Otherwise, a single object does not exist. And I say you can't. Without a companion object, an object ceases to exist. And again, these people are putting words in my mouth, and it's because they don't look at the fine points. They just slur. They just do it very superficially. I never say an object ceases to exist. These people have this notion that objects begin to exist and cease to exist. These are notions of ordinary speech that they bring into physics, and then they put them in my mouth and they say, oh, Bill, you said that an object ceases to exist if it doesn't have a companion. That's not what I say. Absolutely not. But let's continue. We'll get to that point in a second, because other people are asking things around the same, in the same line of thinking. Okay. So here I clarify first, right, that this is what I say. Okay, just so that you can see the difference. Distance is the separation between objects. Location is the set of distances, and motion is two locations. Okay, two locations of an object. That's the brief version of these words. Okay, so yeah, in order to have location, you must have distance first, and distance you can only have between two objects. Okay, but he's insinuating here that if an object does not have a companion object, it ceases to exist. No, it doesn't exist to begin with. Not ceases to exist. They have this notion that an object disappears. And here's another fellow who has similar idea. And here it is again. I want to show that all these people have the same erroneous notion. They have the notion of ordinary speech. It says, when two stars collide and merge into one, do they become one object? Without a second reference point, do they both cease to exist? Again, the same phrase. They have this notion of cease and beginning to exist. They're thinking of God or a Big Bang, that something begins to exist. That's not the notion of science. The notion of science is a little different. Okay, and before I get there, they say become one object. No, you never become. In science, we do not become an object. An object is that which you point to, not something that becomes. And so they have this notion of this dynamic motion of objects, that objects are changing shape and that they become objects, like, a baby becomes an object, I guess, when the sperm hits the egg or something. That's the origin of that object. That they have the notion of beginning to exist and beginning to become an object. And this notion has to disappear. So let's look at it from a rational scientific point of view. Here you have an object. That object does not exist by definition. Okay, it doesn't exist by definition because there is no object with which to compare it with. Okay, so that object does not exist. Okay, and here we have another object, probably more familiar to you, and that's this fellow God. And does he exist? Well, that object does not exist all by itself. And we're not talking about his hand existing with respect to his face. Again, you have to know which object you're talking about. Are you talking about the hand, or are you talking about God? You got to look at the system. And if we're going to talk about God, him as one object, we can't have him moving. He's not made of parts. He's made of a single piece. Okay? I hope we got that, because otherwise we have more than one object. And we're talking about a single object. And if we're talking about a single object, we can't have that object in motion. And that object is not made of parts. We say God and we point, and that's the object. We're looking at just the outline there, essentially, the shape. That object does not exist until God creates something, if he can do that. I mean, if he's rigid, not made of parts, he can't create. But let's assume that he does it somehow, magic. And now God exists. God has now location. Because why? God exists. Why? Because he has location. He has location with respect to other objects. Okay? He has distance with respect to other objects. Now God can be said to exist by definition, not because I believe or disbelieve. Okay? So these are important points that people talk about. Coming into existence, beginning to exist, beginning to become an object. Those notions are of ordinary speech, and people don't realize that the word exists and the word entity, the word thing, are extremely important. And they have to be extremely careful when they use those words, because the tendency is to introduce ordinary speech into science. And they do that constantly. They don't realize that they get tangled in their own language. Why? Because they don't define things crisply, rigorously. And so we have to understand that, if God wants to exist, he cannot be the sole object in the universe made of a single piece. Okay? Important. Single piece. Okay? We're not talking about his hand existing with respect to his nose, because then we're talking about two objects. We're talking about the system we call God. God is a single piece. He doesn't exist until we have some other object. Okay, we're looking at cross-section of time, single piece, just a shape there in front of us. Okay, the only way we can get God to exist is if we put another object in there somehow. Okay, he has to have distance with respect to the other object. Okay, and along the same lines, someone asks the following question. Okay, says again, making fun of me. Okay, when an object changes location, we call it motion. No, again, wrong. That's not what I say. And people, again, they read everything superficially, and they bring words of ordinary speech into science, and they put words in my mouth. No, the word change should never be used, because the word change is a synonym of the word motion. So you should never use the word change to define motion, because change is motion. So I don't say that an object changes location is the definition of motion. People don't realize these things. They have this ordinary speech, this vulgar notion of what motion is, and they say, "Oh, Bill said that it's a change in location." No, that's what everybody says out there. They use the word change. You can't use the word change. No. What was change? I'm sorry. What was motion? Let's see if I can get it back up here again. There we go. Motion to locations, not change in locations. Unless you understand that difference, you haven't understood anything. And you're putting words in my mouth. Okay? Okay, audience, but locations is only relative. Yeah? Do you define absolute location? I have no idea what absolute location means. How do you know which object moved? Okay, that question I like. That's why I put this up here. He says, I say, don't ask, don't tell. No, I do have an answer. But he continues, says, what if both objects moved the same amount and their relative location did not change? Did motion occur? Very interesting question. Okay? In other words, the two objects move at the same distance, right? Okay, so let's first put our definition of motion here. Okay? We have distance, separation between objects, location, set of distances, and motion to locations. Okay, so first let's understand what we mean by motion and by location by distance. And here we have a pictorial representation of that. We have a movie, a little film strip. The distance is the separation between all these objects inside one frame. Location is the set of distances, and we want to look at the location of God from a physical point of view. We don't look at numbers. We don't look at how many steps you take. No, we just say, look, the distance between all these objects to God, that's the location of God in the universe. And what is motion? Well, we have two or more locations. Okay, so here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 locations of God with respect to those objects. And in fact, each one of those objects moved with respect to all others. Okay, so that's the notion of physics. That's what motion's going to mean. And now here we have, two objects. Like this fellow said, they're both moving. They maintain the same distance. Okay, and the question this fellow asked is, did they move? Okay, oh, wrong one. Did these two move? Or did any of them move? Because they maintain the same distance. See, as they go across, the distance between them remains the same. So he asks, did they move? Well, the problem here is that he is using the black part as a frame of reference. What this fellow is saying is that an object moves with respect to space, and he's treating space as a physical object. Again, through space, in space, that notion doesn't exist in science, in rational science. There's no such thing as space. Space is the same thing, a word as nothing. So when you say that the objects move through nothing or are in nothing, exist in nothing, that's what you're saying. You're saying that, it somehow you're treating space as a physical object, as an ocean, a cosmic ocean, and you're putting physical objects within this ocean. You're treating space as an object, and now the motion of these two objects are with respect to this frame of reference, space. So let's do it the scientific way. This is the way we do it in science. And let's get rid of this one so it doesn't confuse you. Now, can you tell me whether those two objects moved? They maintained the same distance between them. There's no reference other than that. One object with respect to the other. The black stuff, that's nothing. Can you tell me whether any of those two moved? Maybe they're moving with respect to space. Is that what you're going to say? In other words, this is the vision you have to have when you're talking about location and about motion. The vision is that these two objects are not moving. They're not moving because there's no change in distance, and that's all we have in the universe. So there is no change in distance between them. And if there's no change in distance, we don't have motion. In this case, distance is a synonym of location because location is going to be gauged only with the only other object that there is. This is the entire system. If you put more objects in there, then you have distance with respect to all these objects, and you can relate the motion of the object as a set of distance, as a set of locations. But here you only have two objects, and so the distance is the location. The only way you can gauge location here is with, as a synonym of distance. And has distance changed? Has location changed? The answer is no. As long as distance doesn't change, location doesn't change. And that's because we're gauging distance and location of one object with respect to the other, not with respect to space, to the frame of reference that we had in the previous picture. So let's look at the difference again. Here you have a moving. Why? Because you're using space as a frame of reference. You're assuming space is a physical object. You're treating space as an ocean. You're saying, okay, it's got borders, and the two objects are moving with respect to the borders of space. That's what you're saying, okay? And here, there is no motion. Why? Because, you know, we're not using space as a gauge, as a reference point, as a frame of reference. All we're using is one object with respect to the other, okay? Okay, so I hope that explains that one. Let me get back to Ayn here. Good old Ayn Rand. She had these, because of her philosophy, her objectivism, she ended up with weird notions of what an object is. And I covered that last week, so I'll just go real quick through it. She ended up believing that air and water are not physical objects, even though we can grasp them with the senses. I mean, hopefully you wave your hand and touch air. You feel something there. We'll call that air, right? Gas, whatever you want to call it. And you also have water. Hopefully you can see and touch water. And she says those are not objects, and it's not an entity. And because they are not entities to begin with, and only entities can exist, then you have to conclude from her line of reasoning that water and air do not exist. That's her logic, okay? That's objectively her logic, and I'm sure a lot of people don't like it, what I'm saying. I'm talking about objective. I don't care what you interpreted. I don't care what your philosophy is. I don't care if you love Ayn Rand, okay? I'm talking about objective analysis of what Ayn Rand wrote, okay? And she says that fluids are not entities. And then she's going to say that only entities exist, which by logic says that water and air do not exist according to Ayn Rand. Because she does it all with see and touch. And I know you're going to beat me up. I know you don't like what I'm saying. I'm just telling you what is objectively in her writing. She did not realize this. And again, because she didn't do a thorough study of ontology, of what exists. She wanted to do politics and behavior. She wanted to do ethics. What is right and wrong? What is the best form of government? And so she cared very little about existence. She just slurred over it. She did it superficially and said, let's continue. And I want to point out that she failed at ontology. She failed at defining what an entity is and what exist means. Okay, that's the point I'm trying to make here. Okay, and here's another, I'm just going to rub it in until it hurts. Okay, here's another notion that she had. Existence, she says reality exists. Okay, existence exists, that's poetry, great, love it. Great for a song. She included the observer. These are the criticisms I have about her. Knowledge, consciousness, perception, see, touch, senses, that's all she talked about. Okay, so again, existence was subjective according to her. Something exists which one perceives. No. Something exists which matches the definition of existence. That's what exists. You can't say that something exists because you can touch or see it, because we cannot see or touch a magnetic field. And I'm not talking about one where you would pour iron filings over. I'm talking about a lodestone you find in the middle of nowhere. How do you know it's a lodestone? How do you know it's got a magnetic field around it if you can't see or touch it? Okay, you would have to bring the iron filings or another magnet and say, well, let's see if this is a lodestone. And then if it attracts it, you say, oh, it's got a magnetic field. But you would not know that. You would not realize that. You would not visualize that unless you did some kind of test. If you just look at a lodestone, you can't tell whether it's got a magnetic field, and you can pass your hand around there and you won't touch the magnetic field. So that's a lousy criteria for existence, what she proposed. She says, which one perceives. Okay? We have to know whether a lodestone has a magnetic field before we run any test. I show you a stone out there, in the middle of nowhere, does it have a magnetic field around it? Surely you will not be able to see it, do it through see and touch. Not if I put you alone in the universe with a lodestone. Tell me if it's got a magnetic field and your life is on the line. Are you going to say that it does or doesn't? Okay? You have nothing else with which to test it except your hand and your eyes. Okay? So no, her notion was wrong, and that's why she ended up going around in circles. She says sensation tells man that entity, right, that an entity exists. And if that's the case, if sensation tells you, then air and water exist. But she said that those were not entities. Okay? So you figure it out. Okay? And of course she did the same errors that human Kant did. You know, she couldn't tell the difference between exist and entity, exist and thing. She could not tell me whether a thing, what the difference between thing and exist is. Okay? Okay, and she, because of this, she also included, you know, things which are completely erroneous, and I'll put her, I guess, on this side here. Okay, and she concluded, okay, erroneously again, that you know, you have atoms and subatomic particles. Well, how did she know? Did she touch them? Did she smell them? Did she see them? She just takes for granted that they exist. And she says that energy also exists, which is a concept. So here we have you know, entities such as water and air, which are not entities according to her, and therefore do not exist because entities exist, and what those things which are not entities do not exist. So water and air do not exist, fluids do not exist according to her, but energy, which is a concept, does exist. And I know you don't like what I'm saying. It hurts, but I'm telling you what her reasoning was, or what her reasoning led to. She did not have this very crisply in her mind of what ontology was. In other words, what things truly exist and what things don't exist, because she never defined entity very precisely, very rigorously, and therefore she could not figure out, you know, existence as well. And so what are the problems that I point out with Ayn's notion of existence? Well, here they are. Is an entity or a concept? You know, we have A, right? Whatever A is. We have to determine whether it's an entity or a concept. She never figured that out. She ended up saying that energy and energy existed, was an entity apparently in her mind, and so were subatomic particles, right? And on the other hand, water and air were not. And then the question is, in her mind, did concepts exist or not? Well, energy is a concept, and she put it under existence. So no, she had a mumble jumble in her head. She did not figure out that energy was a concept, and there is no physical object called energy is not an entity, and therefore energy cannot be said to exist. She's playing around with words that she did not understand, because you can say, well, she was not a physicist. Well, she was trying to do ontology. So you can't excuse her by saying, well, she was not a physicist. We're all physicists. Anyone who uses the word exist in a debate, discussion, dissertation has crossed the line into physics, whether he knows it or not. He's a physicist at that moment in time, okay, whether that person knows it or not. And what is an entity? According to Ayn, it was see-touch. That's the criteria she used. She said perception, senses. Okay? She did use that. She, on the one hand, she said that's what you can point to. Fine. She would have stopped there. She would have been more or less in the ballpark, because all you can point to is shape. You can't point to that which has no shape. You can't point to nothing. Okay? To space. What you're pointing to is not space. Okay? You're pointing to a dark stuff that you have not figured out what it is, because you have not defined what an object is. And if an object is that which has shape, space does not have shape, because space is nothing. Nothing does not have shape. That's the definition of nothing. That which doesn't have shape. Okay? That's the way it's got to be used in a rational way. Okay, and so you know, she had all these issues. In rational science, very straightforward. Physical presence. What does that mean? Physical refers to an object, and presence refers to location. If the object has location, it exists by definition. Okay. Okay, so someone made a comment, and this visitor said, Rand's objectivism doesn't require observers in order to define existence. Well, as we see, yeah, it does. And this is objectively. What she insinuated, what she meant to say, well, I don't care what people interpret. I'm just saying what she said, and we take that objectively. Okay, we do not second guess Ayn Rand. We just take her writings literally. Okay, no attempt to interpret. Okay, and of course, because of that, you get to this situation where she says existence exists. That statement implies two corollary axioms. Something exists which one perceives. Was she subjective or not? Did she introduce an observer or not? If something exists which one perceives, then she's got the wrong notion of existence. And then it says, one exists possessing consciousness. Consciousness being the faculty of perceiving that which exists. Okay, so is Ayn Rand introducing observers? Is she introducing subjectivity? Or should we continue calling her subjective notions objectivism? This is the problem. People are not reading Ayn Rand critically. Those people who love Ayn Rand because of her political and ethical philosophy, fine, doesn't concern, that's religion. If you like, politics, fine. Politics is all religion. There's no such thing as political science. It's political religion. Politics is all religion. It's all belief. It's all, interest. It's my belief against your belief. That's all it is, the clash of beliefs. That's all that Ayn Rand did. All she did was talk about ethics and philosophy and politics. She called it philosophy, objectivism, which is subjectivism. Okay, and here's a final notion. It's got to do with consciousness, and that puts also existence within the proper context. And good old Ayn, she said, first of all, she used. I took note of how many times she used the word consciousness, and conscience in her 577,000 word Atlas Shrugged, okay, her most famous writing, her most famous book. It was a novel, and you can see she used the word consciousness, and this is primarily in John Galt's speech, which she does towards the end of the book, where she kind of synthesizes her philosophy, right, political philosophy, right. And she used the word quite a bit of times. She used it 89 times, 137 times consciousness, 22 times conscience. So she was heavily into consciousness, into what people have in their minds, subjectivism. That which you call your soul or spirit is your consciousness, okay? She's just putting a synonym there, right? Consciousness is the faculty of awareness, the faculty of perceiving that which exists. Again, perception, senses. Okay, what's in the mind, not and in the hands, in the sense of touch, not what exists by definition. God does not exist because I think He exists, because I sensed Him, because I touched Him, or because God came into my mind in a dream or whatever. No, God exists by definition or not. If He meets the definition of exist, He exists by definition. Period. We're done. Okay. And of course that outlaws atheism as well, because the atheists also get into this word belief and disbelief. That's not the way it works in science. Science opposes atheism, because in science we don't say, well, do I believe in God? Can I prove God? Can I run a test? Can I touch Him? Can I see Him or hear Him? Or was that God who talked to me? No, we don't go into any of that. That's subjectivism. What we say in science, define the word exist. What does exist mean? Physical presence. Object that has location. Does God have location? In your theory, in your explanation, then God exists for the purposes of your theory so that we can understand what you're talking about. That's the way it works in science. We need to be rational in the way we explain a theory to someone else. You have to start, if you're going to do a physical theory, you have to start with the word exist. You got to say, what do you mean by exist? What do you mean by object? An object is that which has shape. If it has location, it also exists. We're done. Now, Does your God have shape? Is God a human-like figure, or is God love? Is God intelligence? Because if God is intelligence, he doesn't exist by definition, not because I believe in him or disbelieve in him. Okay? And existence and consciousness constantly put the observer in their subjectivism in every two sentences. And you can see by the number of times you use consciousness, right? Are axioms you cannot escape. These two are the irreducible primaries implied in any action you undertake, in any part of your knowledge. Again, that word knowledge, all subjective. Whether you know the shape of a pebble or the structure of a solar system, the axioms remain the same. That it exists and that you know it. So we have existence related to consciousness and to knowing. Subjective? Yeah, we know that God exists, right? I mean, I know, right? It's my consciousness that tells me that God exists, okay? So we know that God exists, right? I mean, if we follow her prescription, that's what we end up with, okay? And let me show you my comparison here. This is from my book in comparison to hers, right? How many times do I use the word conscious or consciousness? In the entire book, I have half the words in my book, why God doesn't exist. Consciousness 9 times. Consciousness 4 times. Conscious 9 times. And most of those are, I put the breakdown there. 7 are quotes of other people. That's how I used it. I didn't use consciousness to analyze consciousness itself. 2 of them are with respect to time, again, because time requires memory, a recording device, okay, as we discussed in the past. And 2 of them I talked only in relation to whether plants have consciousness. So, you know, I don't use the word consciousness at all, essentially, okay? And again, I put down there, consciousness introduces subjectivity, biases, and observer into science. That's why we don't use it. We treat anyone introducing the 4-letter word consciousness into the dissertation in any way, shape, or form as a Hare Krishna loony, okay? So please do not bring 4-letter words such as consciousness into the discussion, okay? In any way, shape, or form, we have no use for consciousness. We don't have use for the word knowledge. We don't have use for evidence. We don't have use for any of these words that belong to ordinary speech and which the mathematicians have brought into science and the philosophers have brought into so-called philosophy, which they never defined. And all this comes from good old Aristotle was the guy who began all this mixture. Because if you look at his book, especially Metaphysics, he starts out with what exists and he ends up talking about philosophy. And that's what everybody does today. You know, they say, you know, they talk about what exists. Does God exist? And then they go into philosophy, which is religion. You know, political philosophy or religious philosophy. And you got all these different notions. In fact, here I got something that puts puts it in the right frame. You get the definition of exist that we have out of the Wikipedia, which is the notion that most people have out there, by the way, okay? And it says existence, the ability of an entity to interact. So we have to see something in motion before you can call it existence. The earth doesn't exist until it interacts, okay? With physical or mental reality. So if something reacts with your mental reality, it exists. And reality, by the way, is a synonym of existence. So they're using a synonym to define existence. But aside from that, you know, what do you mean it interacts with your mental reality? So if I got, you know, cocaine in my bloodstream and I'm, you know, on cloud 9, my mental reality is a little different than yours probably at that point. And if that's the case, what are we saying? We're saying that something is interacting with my mental reality. What can that possibly mean? And if you look up those words, you'll find just synonyms. You know, in philosophy, it refers to the ontological property of being. What is being? Well, being means existence. If you look at these words are all synonyms. So all they do is just use synonyms to define words. Those are circular definitions, or as I like to say, no definition at all. And here's from dictionary.com. Exist, to have actual being, to be, to have life, animation, live. Look at being, existing. Look at the verb to be, exist, or to live. So what have we learned? What does exist mean? And because they have these lousy definitions, these definitions of ordinary speech that everyone uses, we end up, the wiki, okay, ends up with this funny conclusion. And the conclusion goes like this. It says, materialism holds that the only things that exist are matter and energy. Idealism holds that the only things that exist are thoughts and ideas. Scholasticism, existence of a thing is not derived from its essence, but is determined by the creative volition of God. Really love it. And in Eastern philosophy, impermanence describes existence. It refers to the fact that all conditioned things are in a constant state of flux. Okay? So what have we learned about existence today? Have we learned anything from these people? This is after 2,500 years of dealing with existence since the days of Aristotle. Here these people talk about existence. Nobody can define the term. Nobody knows what existence means, but everybody knows for a fact whether God exists or not. And see, we have a problem. We had to erase the board completely and start all over. And that includes Ayn Rand. We have to wipe her out completely because she was doing philosophy according to Aristotle, not according to the rational scientific method. Rational scientific method defines these words rigorously and precisely. We do not allow one iota to move sideways or whatever. Some people were criticizing the other day. They were talking about whether we do experiments in science. Well, if the definition of science is rational explanations, where do you see a provision for the word experiment in there? And people say, well, Bill, but then you're departing from what everybody out there and their mother understands by the word science. Yeah, no kidding. We're telling you that we raised the board completely. And you say, well, that's not going to be very popular. We don't care. We're not here to get subscribers. We're here to give you a difference from what the establishment does. And it's up to you to take it or leave it. I mean, we don't care. We're not going to sacrifice the definitions to get subscribers. So if all the people out there believe or have this notion that you have to do experiments in science, no, experiments are used to prove, to create evidence, to persuade people. We don't do experiments in science. We explain them. Science we only explain. As long as we stay there, nobody will get hurt. Okay? And we're not going to bend the definition of science to accommodate subscribers and visitors and whatever. No, it's up to you. We tell you what rational science proposes. Whether you believe it, whether you like it or not, that's your personal business. We do not interfere there. That's religion. You've created your own religion. Anyways, with that, I don't have time today to answer questions, but I will look at what people wrote. And if there's something interesting, I'll present it next time around. I will continue with Ayn Rand, and unfortunately I'm going to have to get into a subject I don't want to get into, which is her political so-called philosophy. In other words, what Ayn Rand used that objectivism, that objective philosophy for, which was, altruism, politics, this kind of thing. I'll go over a little bit of that because it does involve another aspect of what this site is about, okay? Another aspect of science that I cover, every so often. So we'll see you then. We'll see you on, Wednesday? We'll see you on Wednesday. Bye-bye.